The chair scraped against the floor as the Varric delegate pointed at the holographic map, and every eye in the chamber turned toward me. I did not look at the map. I looked at him. His name was Sovol Dren. He stood nearly 3 meters tall, his body a slow shifting lattice of pale crystal and living light, his voice like the sound of 2 flat stones grinding together in a cold river. He had been a delegate of the Galactic Conclave for longer than my entire civilization had kept written records. He had watched empires rise and fall from that very seat, and right now, he was pointing at a tiny blinking dot on a holographic display and telling me exactly where I belonged. "We will show you your position, human," he said. The dot was labeled Sol System, Tier 7, Provisional Status, Unclassified. The chamber around me was enormous. A cathedral of living architecture that had grown and shifted over 600 years of continuous session. The walls breathed. The ceiling was a slow-moving river of bioluminescent gas that served as both lighting and a kind of communal mood indicator for the species that could read it. The floor was a single piece of material that no human scientist had been able to identify from the scans we took on approach, something between stone and muscle, warm under my boots, faintly responsive. There were 41 delegations seated at the great elliptical table, 41 species, each representing civilizations that ranged from 200 years of spaceflight to over 12,000. Their flags, their symbols, their entire histories floated in soft light above each seat. Some of them had translators built directly into their bodies. Some communicated in frequencies I could not hear. Some had sent not their leaders but their second or third representatives, because this session had been called as a routine classification review, and humanity was the only item on the agenda that anyone considered worth the commute. My seat was at the far end of the table, not at the curve where the senior delegates sat, not at the sides where the mid-tier civilizations placed their ambassadors. I had been given the last chair, the one that sat in the narrow end of the ellipse, the one where the light was thinnest and the air recycler made a faint ticking sound every 11 seconds. I had counted it already. I count things when I am trying to stay calm. My name is Cale Morrow. I am 39 years old. I grew up in a small coastal town in England where it rained more days than it did not, where my father worked on boat engines and my mother taught secondary school mathematics. I joined the Earth Defense Corps at 21, not because I wanted to see the stars, but because I believed in something, though I could not have told you exactly what at the time. By 32, I had commanded 3 deep space operations, negotiated 2 resource treaties with the Atheni border scouts, and survived a catastrophic hull failure on a patrol vessel that left me floating in a pressure suit for 19 hours before recovery. The Earth Council had sent me here because they said I was the steadiest person they had. I hoped they were right. The chamber had gone quiet in a way that had texture to it. It was not the quiet of respect. It was the quiet of a crowd watching something small and unfamiliar try to navigate a space that was not built for it. I had felt that quiet before. In other rooms, on other days, it never gets easier to sit inside of. But I had learned over the years that the worst thing you can do when you feel that kind of quiet is to make yourself smaller. Sovol Dren had not finished. He swept one long, translucent arm across the display and pulled up a secondary data panel, and it listed, in the Conclave's standard classification language, a full breakdown of humanity's Tier 7 designation, 61 years of confirmed interstellar travel, no established diplomatic history prior to first contact, limited resource footprint beyond home system, no record of interspecies alliances, conflict history flagged as internally chronic, classification, provisional pending full review, estimated timeline 400 years. 400 years. Several of the delegates shifted in their seats. One of them, from a species I knew only as the Mulhari, made a sound that their translator rendered as polite acknowledgement. Another, from the Duren collective, tilted its cluster of sensory organs in what I had been told was the equivalent of a shrug. Sovol Dren looked at me for the first time since I had entered the chamber. His eyes were not eyes the way I understood eyes, but there were 2 places on his face where the crystal lattice deepened and darkened, and caught the light differently, and I had learned to read them. They held no particular malice. That was almost worse. This was not cruelty, this was just administration. You are, of course, welcome as a provisional observer, he said. Humanity's application has been noted and the review cycle will begin in the standard fashion. You may speak during open comment periods of no more than 3 minutes each. Voting rights will be considered at the conclusion of the 400-year review. I heard the ticking of the air recycler. 11 seconds. 12. 13. I stood up, not quickly, not with any particular drama. I pushed my chair back and I stood, and the sound of it moved through the chamber the way a stone moves through still water. in rings. Several delegates turned. The Mulhari representative froze mid-gesture. One of the Ethani seated far to my left, a species that had not spoken in a conclave session in 600 years, raised its long neck slightly and angled a single dark eye in my direction. Soval Dren looked at me. His crystal structure made a faint sound, like a glass bell touched once and left to fade. "You have not been recognized to speak," he said. I said, "I am not speaking yet. I am standing." I reached into my jacket and pulled out a small data chip, the kind used for conclave display interface, which I had been told was compatible with the main holographic system. I had prepared it on the flight here, across 12 days of faster-than-light travel, in a cabin the size of a generous closet, running on reheated ration packs and a thermos of coffee that I stretched across 4 days, because I did not know if there would be more. "I would like to invoke Article 7 of the Conclave Charter," I said. "The right of any attending delegation, provisional or full, to present historical record in response to a classification determination." The chamber held. Nobody moved. Soval Dren's crystal eyes shifted. He turned to the session recorder, a small, automated construct that hovered at the center of the table. The construct processed for 3 seconds, which in machine time was a long processing pause, and then emitted a single chime. "Article 7 is valid," it said. "The delegation may proceed." I walked to the central display. Nobody stopped me. I think some of them were too surprised to move. I think others were curious, in the way that ancient settled civilizations sometimes become curious about small, strange things that do not behave as expected. I had counted on that. Not on the surprise. On the curiosity, I slotted the data chip into the display interface and brought up the first image. It was a photograph of Earth. Not from orbit, not the clean blue marble that appeared on our diplomatic materials. This was a ground-level photograph taken in a valley in East Africa, 300,000 years ago in geological proxy, a vast flat plain under an enormous sky, a sky that was burning because a supervolcano had erupted 2,000 kilometers to the east and the ash. Cloud was spreading across the hemispheres, and the small group of figures barely visible at the bottom of the frame were the ancestors of every human being who had ever lived or would ever live. I let that image sit for a moment. "This is where we started," I said, "not with ships, not with mathematics, with fire and stone and the decision to keep walking." The chamber was absolutely quiet. Even the bioluminescent ceiling had gone still. I looked out at 41 delegations representing the collected wisdom and power of the known galaxy, and I felt, for the first time since I had sat down in that small chair at the end of the table, completely steady. "I would like to show you who you are dealing with," I said. "Not our rank, not our tier, us." I advanced to the next image, and the story of humanity began to fill the room. The first image that held the chamber was not a weapon. It was not a ship or a flag or a monument. It was a child's handprint pressed into red clay on the wall of a cave in southern France. 30,000 years old, barely larger than my palm. I had chosen it deliberately. I had spent 3 of those 12 travel days going through the entire archive that the Earth Council had loaded onto. My data chip, 700,000 years of documented human history, compressed into a presentation that had to work in real time, in a room full of beings who had watched civilizations come and go like weather. I had rejected thousands of images. Battles, achievements, disasters, breakthroughs. All of them true. All of them important. But when I thought about what I actually needed the room to understand, I kept coming back to that handprint, because it said, "I was here, I was small, and I wanted you to know." 30,000 years ago, I said, one of my ancestors pressed their hand against wet clay and blew pigment around it. They had no writing, no mathematics, no concept of astronomy beyond what they could see with their own eyes. And yet they felt, in some part of themselves that preceded language, that it mattered to leave a mark, that someone, somewhere, in some time they could not imagine, might see it and understand. The chamber was still. 41 delegations and not one of them made a sound. I advanced the display. The next sequence moved fast, not because I was rushing, but because the pace of human history is genuinely relentless once it begins to accelerate, and I wanted them to feel that momentum. Agriculture appearing in 7 separate locations independently within a few thousand years of each other. Writing invented, lost, reinvented. Mathematics discovered in parallel by civilizations that had no contact with one another. The wheel, the arch, the compass, the lens. We did not have a patron species, I said. No one came to lift us out of the Stone Age. No one handed us a physics textbook or seeded our planet with metals we would need later. Everything we discovered through the oldest method in the universe. We tried something, it failed, someone died, and then we tried again. For 300,000 years, I heard a sound from somewhere near the middle of the table, a soft, low-frequency hum that my earpiece translated as considered attention. It came from the Athene delegate, the one who had raised its neck earlier. The Athene had a reputation in the conclave for being observers only. They had not introduced emotion or addressed the floor in 600 years. Their presence at sessions was understood to be a kind of institutional memory, a living archive. The fact that one of them was making sounds of active attention was, according to everything I had read in the briefing files, unusual. I kept going. I showed them the extinction events, not as disasters but as data points. The Toba supervolcano 70,000 years ago, an eruption so catastrophic that it bottlenecked the entire human population down to an estimated 10,000 individuals. 10,000 people. The genetic record of every human alive today shows the scar of that moment. A narrowing in our diversity that means all 8 billion of us trace back to a group small enough to fit in a moderate-sized town. Other species have faced extinction-level events, I said. Some of them are in this room. Most of them had the benefit of advanced technology. Interstellar evacuation or uplift assistance from allied civilizations. We had none of those things. We had each other, some stone tools, and whatever food we could find, and we survived. Sovol Dren had not moved since I had begun. He was watching me with those deep shifting crystal eyes, and I could not tell what he was thinking, which I had been warned was normal, because Varic emotional processing does not map cleanly onto any human framework. But he was watching. That was enough. I moved through the timeline. The plagues, not one, not two, but recurring waves of disease across recorded history that, by conservative estimate, reduced total human population by 30 to 50% at various points. The Black Death alone, which we now understood was a bacterial infection manageable with antibiotics, killed somewhere between 30 and 60% of Europe's entire population in the span of a few years. We had no antibiotics. We had no understanding of germ theory. We did not know what was killing us. And yet within 2 centuries of that catastrophe, humans were painting the Sistine Chapel, writing plays that are still performed today, and beginning the mathematical revolution that would eventually lead to the telescope. I let that land. We grieve, I said. I want to be clear about that. We are not a species that does not feel loss. We feel it deeply, perhaps more deeply than is practical. But we have a particular relationship with loss that I think is relevant to this review. We grieve, and then we build. We do not grieve instead of building. We do both at the same time. A delegate from the Duren Collective made a sound I did not recognize. My earpiece gave a partial translation, involuntary conceptual processing. I had no idea what that meant, but I chose to take it as a good sign. I advanced to the section of the presentation I had labeled in my own notes as the big pivot. This was where I shifted from ancient history to recent, and by recent I meant the last 200 years, which in a chamber where several delegates represented civilizations 10,000 years old was so recent as to be practically this morning. In the year 1803, I said, the fastest a human being could travel on land was roughly 65 kilometers per hour on a horse, downhill, in good conditions. That was the hard ceiling. That was all we had. I advanced the image. By 1903, we had the first powered airplane, a vehicle with an engine, wings, and a human being inside it, flying under its own power for the first time in the history of our species. 59 meters, 12 seconds. It worked. I advanced again. By 1969, a human being had walked on the surface of our moon, using technology built entirely from scratch, with no external guidance, no alien assistance, no previously existing roadmap. We went from horse to moon in 166 years. The ceiling of the chamber flickered. Several of the bioluminescent streams shifted color. I did not know exactly what that meant for every species present, but I had been told by the conclave's pre-session briefing material that large communal shifts in the ceiling atmosphere were associated with what the chamber's automated systems registered as collective heightened engagement. I pressed on before anyone could speak. In 1945, we detonated the first nuclear weapon. In 1946, we began using nuclear energy to power cities. We took the most destructive technology we had ever created, and we looked at it and we said, can we make this useful? And we did, while simultaneously trying to make sure we never used the weapon version again. Both of those projects ran in parallel. We are a species that can hold enormous contradictions and keep moving anyway. I pulled up the next set of data. This one was not images. It was numbers, clean columns of figures that the display rendered clearly. In the last 200 years, average human life expectancy has increased from 35 years to over 80. Child mortality has dropped by 94%. Literacy has gone from under 15% of the global population to over 90. We have mapped our own genome, cured diseases that had killed millions for centuries, grown food in environments where nothing should grow, and connected 8 billion people in a single communications network that operates in real time across the entire planet. I paused. We did all of this while simultaneously dealing with 2 global-scale wars, dozens of regional conflicts, several near-catastrophic environmental crises, and at least 4 separate moments in the last century, where the combination of weapons technology and political instability meant we were, by any reasonable assessment, a single bad decision away from ending ourselves entirely. I looked at the room. We did not end ourselves. We did not even slow down. Soveldren spoke. His voice was careful, controlled, but there was something under it that had not been there at the start of the session. This historical record is noted, he said. However, the Conclave's classification system is not based solely on historical achievement. It accounts for current stability, diplomatic integration, and the capacity for peaceful interstellar conduct. I understand, I said, and I will address all of those. But I want to make sure this room understands something first, because I think it has been missed. I brought up the final image in this section. It was not dramatic. It was a photograph of a small research station in Antarctica, built by 12 scientists from 7 different nations, sitting on a sheet of ice at the bottom of the world, running on solar panels and determination, monitoring climate data in conditions where machinery regularly failed, and human beings regularly came very close to not coming home. This station, I said, was built and operated continuously for over 40 years by people who had no strategic reason to be there, no commercial incentive, and no guarantee that anyone would ever use the data they were collecting. They went because someone decided it mattered to know. That is the part of humanity that I most want this room to understand. Not the conflicts, not the contradictions, the part that goes to the bottom of the world in the dark and the cold, and sits there for 40 years measuring the temperature of the ice because maybe one day that data will mean something. The chamber was quiet for a long moment. The Ethony delegate lowered its neck slowly, a movement I had no translation for, but which felt, in my gut, like something important. Then the crisis alert sounded, and everything changed. It did not sound like an alarm. The Conclave's emergency notification system was designed for 41 different species, most of whom processed auditory input differently from humans, so it manifested as a simultaneous pulse of light, sound, and atmospheric pressure that every being in the room could perceive in whatever way was most meaningful to them. For me, it hit as a deep vibration in my chest, a flash of amber in the ceiling, and a single tone in my earpiece that the Conclave's briefing had described as the equivalent of a red alert. Every display in the chamber switched from my presentation to a live tactical feed. The Rel Expanse, a sector of fringe space that sat at the outer boundary of Conclave map territory, was lit up in warning markers, and at the center of it, expanding in real time, was a disruption pattern that I recognized from Earth Defense Corps intelligence briefings. I had read about this. I had hoped I would never see it live. The Dusk Covenant had deployed their weapon. My presentation was still running on a small panel in the corner of the display, the Antarctic Research Station glowing quietly, next to a tactical map of a crisis that was about to swallow everything else in the room. I looked at it for just a second. Then I turned to face the chamber, and I saw in the faces of 41 delegations something I had not expected to see: fear, not panic. These were ancient, experienced civilizations. They did not panic easily. But there was something in the room that had not been there before, a specific quality of stillness that I had learned to recognize in my years in the Corps. It was the stillness of people who know something is very wrong and are not sure what to do about it. I had been in rooms like that before. Many times, I knew exactly what to do. I did not sit back down. The tactical feed showed a spreading red bloom across 12 sectors of the Rel Expanse, and in the time it took me to walk from the central display to the emergency data panel on the north wall of the chamber, 3 more sectors had gone dark. Not destroyed, disconnected. The faster-than-light corridors that linked those sectors to the rest of the Conclave's network were collapsing, one by one, like lights going out in a long hallway. I had read the intelligence file on the Dusk Covenant 17 times on the flight here, because the Earth Council had included it in my briefing packet as background context, something that was happening in the galaxy that I should be aware of without necessarily needing to engage with. They were a fringe group, the file said. A loose federation of splinter factions from 4 different species who had become convinced, over several decades of growing radicalization, that the Conclave's centralized corridor network was a mechanism of control, and that the only path to true sovereignty for Outer Rim civilizations was to sever the network entirely. Their weapon was called, in the Conclave's intelligence files, a resonance disruptor. The technical explanation ran for 40 pages that I had read carefully and understood approximately 60% of. The simplified version was this: faster-than-light travel in this part of the galaxy depended on stable spatial corridors, natural channels in the structure of space that ships could enter and ride across enormous distances in manageable time. The corridors had to be maintained, kept stable, kept open. The resonance disruptor fired a specific frequency of energy into the corridor structure that caused rapid, cascading destabilization. A single shot could collapse corridors across a radius of several light-years. Multiple shots, fired in sequence at calculated intervals, could trigger a chain reaction that would spread far beyond the initial target zone. The intelligence file had estimated, with a confidence rating of about 60%, that the Dust Covenant did not yet have the capability for a full-scale deployment. That confidence rating was now clearly wrong. The chamber had erupted in the controlled version of chaos that ancient civilizations produce when they are frightened, which is to say that everyone was talking, but in measured tones, through proper channels, with full diplomatic courtesy, and with the collective urgency of a committee that has realized it needs to schedule an emergency meeting to discuss scheduling the emergency meeting. Sovol Dren was at the head of the primary consultation cluster. 6 senior delegates gathered around the main tactical display, speaking in a rotating loop of formal procedural language. I heard the phrases consensus threshold and standard deliberation window and preliminary assessment phase, and I understood each of those phrases individually, and I understood what they meant together. And I felt something in my chest that was not quite frustration but was adjacent to it. I walked to the emergency data panel and pulled up the full tactical feed directly. The numbers were not good. 17 corridors down in the initial strike zone, 11 more showing destabilization indicators. At the current rate of spread, if nothing intervened in the next 11 cycles, which the Conclave measured in units that translated roughly to 14 of our hours each, somewhere between 40 and 60 inhabited systems would be completely cut off from all faster-than-light travel. No supply lines, no communication, no evacuation routes, just isolated populations, some of them billions of people, sitting in the dark waiting for a rescue that could not reach them because the roads were gone. I ran the numbers twice because the first time I thought I had made an error. I had not made an error. 11 cycles, roughly 6.5 Earth days. I pulled up the Dust Covenant's known vessel positions from the intelligence file and overlaid them on the current tactical feed. The disruption pattern was not random. They were firing in a specific sequence, moving in an arc across the outer edge of the REL expanse, methodical and precise. The way you fire when you have a plan and you have practiced it and you are not afraid of being stopped. I found the gap. There was a window, narrow and closing, between the current disruption arc and the next predicted firing position. A corridor that was still stable, that ran through the inner edge of the REL expanse, that connected directly to the Dust Covenant's current operational center. If someone moved through that corridor in the next 3 cycles, roughly 42 hours, they would arrive ahead of the weapon's next deployment phase, inside the operational perimeter, with the element of surprise. It was not a comfortable plan. It was the kind of plan that my old commanding officer back in the Corps, a woman named Nina Cross who had the patience of stone and the tactical instincts of someone who had spent 20 years solving impossible problems, would have looked at, gone quiet for 10 seconds, and then said, "It is the only thing that works, so let us figure out how to survive it." Nina had retired 2 years ago. I missed her every time things got hard. I thought about what she would do in this room. She would not stand at the edges. She would walk to the center, and she would say what needed to be said, even if no one wanted to hear it. I walked to the center of the chamber. Not to the display panel, not to a side station, to the actual middle of the great elliptical table, where the session recorder hovered. "I need the floor," I said. Sovol Dren looked up from the consultation cluster. "The floor is currently occupied by an emergency session. Provisional delegations do not hold floor rights during crisis protocol." Article 12, I said. "Any delegation may request an emergency presentation if they hold tactical information directly relevant to the crisis at hand." Sovol Dren's crystal structure made a sound like ice shifting. He turned to the session recorder. The recorder processed for 2 seconds. "Article 12 is valid," it said. "The delegation may proceed. Time limit, 5 minutes. I had 4 minutes and 50 seconds of material. I had planned it while walking to the center of the room. I pulled the tactical feed to the main display, and I showed them the gap. I drew the corridor route on the overlay, marked the timing window, and placed the Dusk Covenant's known positions against a projected timeline of their next deployment phase. I did this quickly and without theatrical emphasis, because the numbers were dramatic enough on their own. The disruption pattern has a logical endpoint, I said. If the Covenant fires from this position at this interval, the chain reaction will reach the threshold for irreversible cascade in approximately 8 cycles, not 11. I believe the 11-cycle estimate is based on a standard firing cadence. They are not using a standard cadence. They are accelerating. The consultation cluster had gone quiet. Every delegate at the table was watching the display. The tactical window is 3 cycles from now, I said. After that, this corridor closes and the only available approach vectors require passing through the active disruption zone, which no ship currently rated for conclave deployment can survive. 3 cycles is the hard deadline. I stepped back from the display and I looked at the room. I understand that the conclave standard protocol calls for a deliberation window and a multi-species consensus before any armed response. I have read the charter. I respect the reasoning behind those protocols. They exist because hasty decisions made by powerful organizations in crisis conditions have historically made things worse. That is a real and documented problem, and the people who wrote those protocols were not wrong to write to them. I paused. The deliberation window for a standard armed response is 40 cycles. We have 3. I am not asking you to abandon your protocols permanently. I am asking you to recognize that the protocol was written for a different kind of crisis, and this one does not fit the template. Sovol Dren spoke carefully. What exactly are you proposing, delegate? I had not been called delegate before, not by him. He had been calling me human, which was not technically incorrect, but which was also clearly not the word he used when he was taking someone seriously. I noted the change in terminology and stored it. I am proposing a small, fast, volunteer-based rapid response. No large fleet action. No declaration of war. A single vessel, or at most 2, with a team small enough to move quickly and quiet enough not to trigger the Covenant's perimeter alarms. The goal is not to engage their main force. The goal is to reach their weapons platform and interrupt the deployment sequence. Interrupted how? Said a delegate I had not heard speak before. She was from the Mulhari contingent, small and dense, with 4 eyes that pointed in slightly different directions, and a voice like water moving over gravel. We shut down the power relay that feeds the disruptor, I said. Their weapon runs on a focused energy draw that has to be maintained continuously, between shots. If you cut it, the weapon does not simply pause. The charge dissipates and they have to rebuild from 0. That takes approximately 14 cycles by their own technical documentation, which the Conclave's Intelligence Division acquired 18 months ago, and which is in the file that I am reading from right now. Silence. The intelligence file recommends monitoring, said Sovol Dren. The intelligence file was written before they deployed, I said. Monitoring is no longer an option. The Mulhari delegate made a sound. Her translator rendered it as, this is a reasonable operational premise, but the risk profile for the insertion team is extreme. Yes, I said simply. Another delegate spoke, someone from the outer arc of the table, a species I had not interacted with before, tall and narrow, their skin a deep blue-black that seemed to absorb the light around them. Which species would provide the insertion team? The room waited. I looked at the tactical map for a moment. At the corridor, the window, the 3-cycle deadline. At the 14 systems already cut off and the 40 more at risk. At the billions of people who would have no idea, sitting in their homes on their worlds, that a conversation in a room they had never seen was the hinge point on which everything depended. We will, I said. The chamber erupted, not in argument, not in opposition, but in the particular vocal texture that happens when a large number of beings all process an unexpected statement at the same moment. I stood inside of it and I did not move because I had learned, over 19 hours in a pressure suit in empty space, that stillness is sometimes the most powerful thing available to a person. Sovol Dren's voice cut through the noise. You are 60 years out of your home system. You have no experience with this sector of space. Your vessels are not rated for the corridor conditions in the Rel expanse. And you are here as a provisional observer, not an active member of this body. All of that is true, I said. Then how, he said, and his voice was not unkind, which surprised me. Do you propose to succeed where species with thousands of years of interstellar experience are unable to act? I thought about the handprint in the cave. I thought about 10,000 people at the base of a volcano, in the ash and the dark, deciding to keep walking. I thought about the Antarctic research station sitting quiet and cold at the bottom of the world, measuring the temperature of the ice because someone decided it mattered to know. Because we are not unable to act, I said. We are afraid of the cost. Those are different problems. And the difference between them is the difference between this mission working and not working. The room was very quiet. The Ethany delegate made a sound. My earpiece processed it for a moment and then gave me a translation that I was not entirely sure it had gotten right because it rendered as, "They have always been this way, I remember." I turned to Soval Dren. "Give me access to the emergency vessel bay and authorization for Article 12 rapid response. I will need 40 people, and I will need to leave within 6 hours. Whatever you decide after that, whatever the review process determines, whatever tier you ultimately assign to us, that is yours to decide. But right now, in this moment, I am the only person in this room with a plan that fits the window, and the window is closing." He looked at me for a long time. Then he said, "You have your authorization." I nodded once, turned away from the display, and walked toward the chamber exit. I had 40 people to find and 6 hours to get them ready. And somewhere in the corridor behind me, 41 civilizations that had never taken a human being seriously were watching me leave. And I could feel it, that weight of watching. And I did not let it slow my steps even slightly. There would be time to feel it later. First, we had work to do. The Conclave's emergency vessel bay was located on the station's lowest inhabited level, a cavernous space that smelled of cooling metal and recycled atmosphere, and something faintly organic that I never managed to identify. The ships docked there were not warships. They were rapid response transports, built for speed and versatility rather than direct engagement, and they had been sitting in their docking cradles for what the bay technician, a quiet and efficient being from a species I only knew as the Tessori, told me in careful translated syllables had been several hundred years in at least 2 cases. I did not find that reassuring. I chose the 2 that had been used most recently. Finding 40 volunteers took less time than I expected and produced a kind of feeling I was not prepared for. The 40 people who showed up in that bay over the next 4 hours were not all soldiers. Some of them were. Lieutenant Owen Price had served 8 years in the Earth Defense Corps, quiet and methodical, with the particular calm of someone who had been in difficult situations, enough times that difficulty had stopped surprising him. Sergeant Dana Wolf was younger and faster and had an instinctive grasp of 3-dimensional spatial problems that made her the most valuable navigator I had ever worked with. Corporal Eli Marsh was 24 years old and had never been in a real engagement and had volunteered before I had finished speaking when I made the call over the Earth delegation's communication channel, which still functioned because the corridor back to Earth had not yet been disrupted. But the others were not core. There was a physicist named Clara Holt who specialized in energy systems and had been on the station as part of a scientific exchange program. There was a logistics coordinator named Sam Archer, who had spent 15 years managing supply chains in difficult environments, and who looked at the tactical map for 90 seconds and immediately began organizing the equipment list. There was a young woman named Grace Okafor, who was technically there as a junior diplomatic aide, and who had, according to her file, a secondary qualification in emergency field medicine that was exactly as useful as it sounds when you are about to fly into a disruption zone. There were 37 others. Each of them had a reason to be there. I did not ask what those reasons were. We had a briefing that lasted 40 minutes. I showed them the corridor map, the weapons platform layout from the intelligence files, the power relay position, and the extraction route. I showed them the risk assessments, which were not good, and I did not soften them, because there is a particular kind of respect that consists of giving people accurate information and trusting them to make their own decisions. Nobody left. Owen Price spent the last 10 minutes of the briefing going through equipment checks with the kind of systematic thoroughness that comes from genuine professionalism rather than anxiety. Dana Wolf was already sitting in the lead vessel's navigation seat, running corridor calculations, making small, precise notes on a pad she carried in her left breast pocket. Clara Holt was down in the engine bay with 2 of the Tessori Bay technicians, speaking a language of technical adjustments that transcended species barriers, because physics is physics regardless of who is measuring it. I stood at the bay entrance for 3 minutes before we departed, and I wrote down the names of all 40 people in my log, along with their ranks or roles and the date. It was a human tradition that I had kept since my first command. You write the names before you go, because if something happens and you cannot write them after, someone should have written them down at least once, in a moment when they were all alive and present and ready. Sam Archer saw me doing it and walked over. He was a compact and organized person, in the way that people who have spent decades making complicated systems work tend to be. Every movement economical, every word considered. Is that a memorial thing, he asked, not in a morbid way, just honestly curious. It is a record thing, I said. Every person who goes out deserves to have their name written somewhere by someone who saw them walk out the door. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, put mine down twice. For luck, I did. We left the station at hour 5 of the 6-hour window. 2 ships moving fast and low through the outer approach corridor. Riding a navigational track that Dana had calculated to minimize our sensor signature against the Covenant's known detection grid. The REL expanse opened ahead of us on the forward display, a region of space that looked, on the sensor readout, like a bruised dark patches spreading outward from the active disruption zones, the collapsed corridors showing as dead spots in the spatial mapping data. The insertion corridor we were using was narrow and unstable at the edges, and the first 20 minutes of transit felt like driving a vehicle at speed across a road that was crumbling in real time. The ships handled it. Dana's calculations held. We came out the other side into the inner REL expanse, and for 30 seconds everyone in both vessels was very quiet, because the reality of where we were had settled in. I heard Owen Price in the back cabin say, quietly and without particular drama, "Right then. That is a very human response to arriving somewhere dangerous." I found it genuinely steadying. The Covenant's weapons platform was visible on our forward sensors within 4 minutes of corridor exit. It was not a beautiful piece of engineering. It was functional and purposeful and clearly built by people who cared about results more than appearance. A large central hub with radiating arms, each arm terminating in a deployment array. The whole structure positioned at the center of a low-orbit path around an uninhabited rock of a planet that served as a gravitational anchor. The power relay was on the hub's southern face, accessible from the outside through a maintenance bay that the intelligence file described as lightly secured. Lightly secured, in context, turned out to mean 4 automated sentry drones and a physical lock that Clara Holt spent 12 minutes and 14 seconds defeating with a combination of signal tools and what she described afterward as aggressive improvisation. Those 12 minutes and 14 seconds were the longest period of sustained waiting I have experienced in my professional life, and I have been floating in a pressure suit in empty space for 19 hours. The drones were the immediate problem. They ran on a rotation pattern that the intelligence file had documented 18 months ago, and rotation patterns change, and these had changed, and so for approximately 4 minutes we were working with incomplete information and relying on Dana's real-time sensor tracking to tell us where each drone was at any given moment. She did this from the ship in low hover, maintaining position with a precision that should not have been possible given the interference from the nearby disruption fields. And she did it while simultaneously keeping our sensor profile below the platform's detection threshold, and she did it while providing live updates over the comm in a voice so steady, and even that it took me a moment to notice she was doing 3 things at once. Grace Okafor was positioned at the maintenance bay entrance, providing field cover and simultaneously running a medical assessment on Eli Marsh, who had taken a glancing impact from a sentry drone's repositioning arm that had left him with a deep bruise across his ribs and a determination to pretend it had not happened. Grace let him pretend, but she wrapped him anyway, efficiently and quietly, without making it a conversation. Clara got the lock open. Inside the power relay chamber, the equipment looked like the technical documentation had described it. Mostly. There were 2 additional connections that the documentation had not included, which Clara identified as field modifications made after the intelligence file was compiled, which she said, in the careful tone of someone delivering difficult information clearly, changed the shutdown procedure significantly. How significantly? I asked. Instead of a remote disconnect, we need a physical isolation, she said. The relay housing has to be opened and the primary coupling manually removed. The coupling is designed to resist removal during operation, which means it will resist, and removing it while the system is actively charging may cause a feedback pulse. How large a feedback pulse? The technical documentation gives a range, she said. The lower end is uncomfortable. The upper end is not compatible with continued operation of organic tissue, within approximately 8 meters. 8 meters. The relay chamber was 12 meters across. I thought about it for 3 seconds. Can we extend the isolation range? If I reroute the secondary feed through the auxiliary coupling first, the feedback should discharge into the secondary housing and reduce the pulse radius to approximately 3 meters. How long? 6 minutes for the reroute. 30 seconds for the isolation after that. Do it. Clara Holt worked with the focused certainty of someone who understands exactly what they are touching and exactly what it will do, and she did not rush. because rushing at the wrong moment in an energy system is how you make things much worse. 6 minutes and 11 seconds later, she looked up at me and said, "Ready." Owen Price had moved everyone to positions behind the structural barriers at the chamber's far end. He had done it without being asked, which is one of those moments that tells you everything you need to know about a person. I moved back to his position and gave Clara the signal. She removed the coupling. The feedback pulse hit like the world had decided to clear its throat. A concussive wave of energy discharged through the secondary housing exactly as she had predicted. The noise was enormous, and for approximately 2 seconds all our equipment displayed nothing but white noise on every sensor channel. Then the sensors came back, and the weapons platform's power grid was reading 0, and the disruption signatures on the tactical map stopped expanding. Not reversed, stopped. The collapsed corridors were still collapsed. The damage was done. But the chain reaction was severed. The cascade that would have isolated 40 to 60 inhabited systems in a matter of days was cut off at its source. The silence in the chamber after that felt like something you could hold in your hands, Eli Marsh said. It worked. Nobody responded for a moment, because sometimes there is nothing to add to a true statement. We moved to extraction. The Covenant's platform would begin alert protocols within minutes of the power failure, and we needed to be through the insertion corridor and back into stable space before their response units arrived. Dana already had the exit trajectory plotted. The moment all 40 of us were back aboard the 2 vessels, she moved. I sat in the forward compartment and watched the corridor close behind us on the sensor display, the narrow window we had used collapsing in our wake as the disruption interference finally reached it, and I felt the particular quality of relief that comes not from the absence of danger, but from the recognition that the preparation held. I opened my log and I checked the list of 40 names. All 40 were still there. All 40 were coming home. I wrote one additional line under the last name. All present, mission complete, corridor exit confirmed. Then I closed the log and I looked at the forward display, where the conclave station was already visible as a point of light, growing slowly larger as we crossed the distance back. Sam Archer came and sat in the co-pilot seat and looked at the same point of light. "Do you think they will change our tier?" he asked. "I honestly do not know," I said. "Does it matter?" I thought about it. It matters for practical reasons: access, voting rights, formal standing. Those things have real consequences for how much we can contribute to what happens out here. "But not for who we are," he said. "No," I said. "Not for that." He nodded and looked at the light. "Put my name down one more time," he said. For the way back, I did. The conclave station came up on the forward display as a full shape, enormous and living, its surfaces shifting in the slow biological rhythms that the station's original architects, a species that had been extinct for 3,000 years, had built into the structure as a form of continuous self-maintenance. I had found it unsettling on approach the first time. Now coming back, it looked like a harbor. Dana brought us in with the same precision she had used going out, clean and quiet, the docking seals engaging without drama. The bay doors closed, the atmosphere equalized. The bay lights were the ordinary operational lighting of a working space, not the amber of emergency alert, which meant the station had returned to standard protocol, which meant the crisis had been recognized as contained. We sat in the docked ships for a few minutes before anyone moved. Not because we needed to, but because there is a natural pause that happens after a hard thing is done, a moment where the body decides it is safe to acknowledge what it has just been through. I did not rush it. I sat, and I thought about the 7 days that had brought me here. From the Earth Council briefing room in London to this docking bay, the distance seemed larger than any measurement I could put on it. Owen Price was the first to stand. He stretched, made a sound of pure physical relief, checked his equipment with the systematic habit of someone who does it automatically, and then said, "T. I would commit minor crimes for T right now." There was a brief ripple of exhausted laughter through both ships, the particular laughter of people who have been operating at the edge of their capacity for hours, and are now discovering that they still have the ability to find something funny, which is one of the more reliable signs that everyone is going to be all right. We walked out of the bay and into the station's lower corridors, 40 people moving through a space built for creatures of entirely different shapes and sizes, and I noticed something that had not been true when we arrived. There were people watching, not a crowd. The conclave was too old and too disciplined for crowds, but in the corridor junctions, in the observation bays, in the doorways of the various offices and meeting rooms that lined the station's interior, delegates and their staff had gathered in small quiet groups, and they were watching us walk in. Species I could name and species I could not. Beings of a dozen different physical configurations, standing still in the light of a corridor that recycled every 11 seconds and watching 40. Humans walked back from a place where they had not expected to succeed. Nobody said anything. Nobody moved to block us or stop us. They just watched. I did not fully understand what I was seeing until we reached the main corridor junction that led back to the residential levels, and one of the Atheni, not the delegate from the chamber but a younger one, a researcher or a junior staff member, stepped forward. She was tall and precise in movement, and she held in her four-fingered hand a small flat object that I recognized after a moment as a conclave acknowledgement token. It was a formal object, rarely used, that signified recognition of significant contribution to the conclave's welfare. She did not speak. She placed the token on the corridor wall beside the junction, in a position that would be visible to anyone passing through, and then she stepped back. And as she did, another being, from a species I had not previously interacted with, placed a second token beside the first. By the time we had passed through the junction, there were 9 tokens on the wall. I did not have a word for what I felt at that moment. I think it was something close to being understood, which is different from being praised, different from being thanked, different from being recognized in any formal sense. It was the feeling of having been seen clearly by someone who had not expected to see what they saw and having that change something in them. I kept walking. There was still work to do. The formal session reconvened 16 hours after our return, once the damaged delegations had received initial status updates. The tactical situation had been documented, and the conclave's procedural requirements for an emergency review had been satisfied. I had spent most of those 16 hours writing reports, responding to queries from the Earth Council, sleeping for 4 hours in a room that smelled faintly of ozone, and eating 3 meals from the station's human-compatible food supply, which had been stocked as a diplomatic courtesy, and which was, I had to admit, considerably better than ration packs. Clara Holt spent 6 of those hours working with 3 conclave engineers on a technical analysis of the weapons platform's power system, because the shutdown we had performed was a temporary interruption and not a permanent solution, and she had come back from the mission with enough hands-on data to contribute meaningfully to the long-term fix. She did this without being asked. That was entirely characteristic of her. Dana Wolf spent 2 hours of the downtime compiling her corridor navigation data into a formal file and submitted it to the Conclave's navigational database, with a cover note explaining the methodology. The Conclave's navigation division sent back an acknowledgement within 40 minutes, which Owen Price told me was faster than they typically responded to submissions from species with centuries of membership. Grace Okafor wrote up 7 field medical reports, complete with treatment records and outcome notes, in the format the Conclave required for official documentation, which she had learned from a procedural guide during the flight over. Eli Marsh insisted in each of his sections that the rib impact had been minor. Grace let him have that but included the actual medical assessment in a separate notation. These were humans being exactly who they were. People who, even after a physically and mentally demanding operation, defaulted to making the information useful and the record accurate. I wrote all of this down because I thought someone should. When the session reconvened, the chamber had a different quality. Not transformed, not suddenly warm, not entirely reconfigured by a single day's events. These were ancient civilizations with established ways of doing things, and one mission, however significant, was not going to rewrite thousands of years of institutional pattern. But the quality of the room was different. The attention was different. Soval Dren opened the session. He stood at the head of the table, his crystal lattice catching the light in its slow shifting way, and he spoke in the formal conclave register that I had come to understand as his default mode, measured and precise and carefully correct. He summarized the crisis, the response, and the current status of the disruption zones. He acknowledged the intervention by the human delegation's rapid response team. He presented the tactical analysis that confirmed the chain reaction had been halted. Then he did something that, according to the briefing material I had read on the flight here, Soval Dren of the Varick Dominion had not done in over 200 years of conclave participation. He moved a motion. I move, he said, for an emergency classification review of the human delegation, with recommendation for immediate elevation to full standing membership at Tier 2 of the Conclave's active member registry. The session recorder chimed. A motion has been entered. Does the motion have a second? The Ethany delegate, who had not spoken since the very old sound she had made during my initial presentation, spoke clearly and without hesitation. Seconded. The vote took 11 minutes, which is fast for a conclave vote when counted in the unit of their historical average. It was unanimous. I sat in my chair at the end of the table, the same chair, the one in the thin light near the ticking air recycler, and I heard the vote complete and the session recorder announce the result. And I thought about my father in his workshop back home, hands covered in engine grease, asking me once when I was about 12 years old what I wanted to do with my life. I had not given him a very good answer. I was not sure I had a better one now, but I thought that what had happened today was at least part of the shape of it. The session moved to a recess after the vote, and in the way of formal gatherings everywhere, people began to move and speak, and the rigid positions of the table dissolved into something slightly more human in the general sense of the word. Sovol Dren crossed the chamber and stopped before me. He was very tall and I had to look up, which I was used to. His crystal structure made the small, faint sound that I had learned to associate with him processing something carefully. I made an assumption, he said, when you arrived, about what your tier designation implied about your capabilities. I know, I said. It was not an accurate assumption. No, I said, it was not. He was quiet for a moment. In a human face, I would have been reading that quiet for emotional content, looking for the angle and the shape of what was behind the words. In his, I could only go by the light in his crystal eyes, and what I read there, as best I could translate it, was genuine reckoning. You will find, he said finally, that the conclave is better at remembering the lessons it has already learned than at learning new ones. We have been here for a very long time and we have made that a virtue. It is also a limitation. I have noticed, I said. Something shifted in his expression, or what served as his expression. You are not angry. About the chair at the end of the table? About any of it. I considered that. Being angry about a mistake after it has been corrected is useful only if it prevents the same mistake from happening again. I would rather spend that energy on the next problem. He looked at me for a long moment. That, he said, is a perspective I would like to discuss further. So would I said, when you are ready. He nodded once, in a way that felt final and beginning at the same time, and returned to the Varric delegation section. The Mulhari delegate came by next, brief and precise, offered a formal acknowledgement in her species' traditional manner, which involved a slow blink of her 4 eyes in a specific sequence, and told me through her translator that her delegation would be submitting a sponsorship request for 3 of the corridors in the Rel Expanse that our mission had indirectly stabilized. She wanted the human delegation's navigational data included in the formal filing. I said that Dana Wolf had already submitted it to the database, and that the Mulhari delegation was welcome to reference it directly. She made the gravel and water sound that her species produced in place of a laugh. The Athene delegate did not approach me. She stood at the far arc of the chamber, in the space near the large observation window that looked out into the deep dark of the station's surrounding space, and she watched the stars for a long time. I watched her watching them. At some point she turned and looked at me across the full width of the room, and she held that look for a moment, and then she inclined her head in a way that no translation could fully render, but which felt, in its simplicity and its directness, like acknowledgement without qualification. I held her gaze and I inclined my head in return. That was enough. That was in fact more than enough. The final open session of the day was brief by conclave standards. There were administrative items, procedural confirmations, the beginning of the long formal process of documenting the emergency response for the historical record. At the end of the agenda, the session chair, a rotating role currently held by a delegate from a species called the Vesson, announced that the human delegation would be invited to speak in the following day's session on the topic of corridor network vulnerability assessment. I noted that in my log, not as a formal record, as something that I wanted to remember. Then at the very end of the session, before the formal closing, the chair asked if any delegation wished to make a statement. I stood, not with a data chip this time, not with a presentation or a tactical map or a sequence of images. I stood at the end of the table in the thin light by the ticking air recycler, and I spoke to the room. I want to say something about the people who came with me yesterday, I said, not as a formal statement, just as a record. The room was quiet. 40 people left this station and 40 people came back. I want you to know who they were, not because of what they accomplished, though what they accomplished was real and it mattered. I want you to know them because each of them made a choice in the 6 hours between the authorization and the departure, and that choice was not made out of obligation or order or any kind of institutional requirement. It was made because they decided that other people's lives were worth the risk to their own. That is the most human thing I know how to describe, and I want the record to show it. I paused. You asked me yesterday what my position was. I stood up to tell you. I am still standing. And I am telling you now, clearly and without any diplomatic softening, that what you saw yesterday from 40 ordinary people who showed up in a docking bay on 6 hours' notice is not exceptional for humans. It is standard. It is who we are when someone needs us to be. I let the room be quiet for a moment. We are 60 years out of our home system. We are new to this. We do not know all of your protocols, all of your history, all of the complexity of what has been built here over thousands of years. But we are here. We are paying attention. And the next time something comes out of the dark that does not wait for 40 cycles and a committee, we will still be the ones who stand up. I sat down, not because anyone told me to, not because I had run out of things to say, because I had said exactly what needed to be said, and the rest belonged to the room. The session closed. Owen Price was waiting outside the chamber doors with 2 cups of tea he had managed to locate somewhere in the station's lower corridors, and he handed one to me without comment, which is one of the most profound forms of human communication, and one that no translator in the galaxy could fully capture. I drank the tea. It was not quite right. The water recycler on the station ran at a slightly different temperature than what produces the ideal brew, and the milk substitute was an approximation rather than the real thing, and the cup was the wrong shape, too wide, too shallow, made for hands with more fingers than mine. It was the best cup of tea I had ever had. I thought about the handprint in the cave, pressed 30,000 years ago into wet clay by someone who only wanted to say, I was here. I thought about 10,000 people at the foot of a volcano deciding that the only direction worth going was forward. I thought about 40 names written in a log before departure, and 40 names still present on the return. I thought about my chair at the end of the table, in the thin light, by the ticking air recycler. I had earned a better seat today. They had offered it in the vote. Full standing, Tier 2. The chair would move, the access would change. The formal weight of humanity's position in that room would be different tomorrow than it had been this morning. But here, right now, standing outside the chamber with a cup of not quite right tea, I thought about what Sam Archer had said on the ship coming back. It matters for practical reasons, but not for who we are. We were still exactly who we had always been. The species that pressed handprints into cave walls because we needed to leave a mark. The species that rebuilt after every disaster. The species that went to the bottom of the world in the cold and the dark, and sat there measuring the temperature of the ice for 40 years because someone decided it mattered. The species that, when 40 people were needed for something dangerous and possibly impossible, filled the docking bay in 6 hours. The galaxy had been here for billions of years before we arrived. It would be here for billions of years after whatever came next. But right now, in this particular moment, on this station, in this cold metal corridor that smelled of ozone and recycled air, humanity was here, and we were paying attention. And that was enough to begin with.